If social media is a key part of your marketing or company strategy, or you want it to be, this episode's for you. I'm covering brand building on LinkedIn and other social channels with a true expert, Danielle Guzman. She is the global head of social media for Mercer, which is a global professional services firm spanning 70 countries with revenue in the billions. We cover it all in this episode, whether it's engaging with comments, leveraging influencers, organizing your team, centralized or decentralized messages and teams, guidelines, how she got the program started, etc. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Danielle. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm great, John. Very nice to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, we're recording this right as the holiday season is in full swing, is in full gear. Our kids are either ending school this week, or in my case, just ended this past Friday, and I'm looking forward to a lot of relaxation coming into the holidays. But I'm really excited to talk to you today because as we wrap up the year and people are focusing on 2023, a lot of companies want to invest in social, invest in their influencer programs, invest in branding on channels that our customers are on. So I wanted to ask about your company, Mercer. You're a global professional services firm. You're in 70 countries. You got 20 or 30,000 employees. What the heck does a social media program look like for a company that size, especially one, although you're known in many circles, you're not Microsoft, you're not Apple. So describe for us what a program looks like and what's sort of in your remit there.
So that's a great question, John. For an organization of our size, I look at both the global and the local. So it's really important that as an organization overall, we have key messages for the firm, who we are, and the conversations that we really want to emphasize with our stakeholders, whether they're PR and media, whether they're our clients, whether they're our colleagues. And then at the same time, how do we take those key conversations and make them locally relevant? Because what's relevant in one market is going to be so different than what's relevant in another market, both for our employees and our external stakeholders. And we do that through kind of an internal connected strategy where from a social media team, we have a global center of excellence. And then we have individuals that are accountable at the global level for parts of our business and then at a local level. And then we work really in tight collaboration together to ensure consistency and continuity. And then obviously the opportunity for local empowerment and customization where it makes sense. And then you see the same on our channels as well. We have channels that are for the overall firm, and then we have channels that are maybe business specific or market specific as well. But when you do zoom in and look across all of those, there's definitely a consistent voice, tone, and kind of key message strategy.
And that totally comes through as a consumer. I mean, it's amazing how diverse your company is in terms of where people are situated, different business line items, and so on. And Danielle, whether it's you posting and you're being, consistent with the company and authentic to yourself, and then also all parts of the business is truly amazing. And we were talking offline last month in prep for this show. I was hoping that you could describe for the audience, since you're like in the run stage right now, it's really impressive. As you incubated this program, like what was like day one like? How did crawl look? How did walk look? How did you get here?
It's a great question. And actually, thank you for saying that we're in run stage. I'm not going to disagree with that, but at the same time, I think it's important that even if you're in run stage, you always have about a quarter of your program where you're constantly reiterating and going back to crawl. Just because, as you know, everything in social media is changing so quickly that you can't really remain stagnant. But when I think back to, a couple of years back, we started smaller, right? So you can't boil the ocean all at once. So if you're trying to build a revenue stream, if you're trying to build maybe something that's emphasizing talent acquisition, or you're trying to bring your employee experience to life, or maybe you're trying to build your visibility as a brand around specific topics, you can't do it all day one. And I think we want to do it all. I'm guilty of that too. But it comes down to obviously not just resources, but knowing that you need to get those small wins to enable opportunity, whether that's resources, whether that's dollars, and then how to prioritize your time so that you can then scale and show those results. So we started a lot smaller. And we actually started by, first of all, just taking a sense and a footprint look at where are we? What is the brand risk on these channels anywhere in the world today? And do we need to be in all these places? We went from a very decentralized model to one that is centralized but locally empowering, meaning we understand where we are. We have guidelines and processes to keep everyone safe, the brand and our colleagues, and then really decide where do we want to be, where are our customers, and start there first. So we actually went through a shrink first, then grow strategically. And then the second thing we did is we really looked at how do we determine if we're even creating value? And then when we're creating value, how do we determine if we're creating business impact? And we went from a myriad of different ways of looking at that to just very few consistent measures across the globe. And that doesn't mean that they're the right ones for everyone and they're the only ones. But if there's one or two things that you're going to look at as a firm, just decide on what those are for right now. And you can add to those as you go forward. But at least you can demonstrate that, build around that, and then scale out. Because there's always going to be something else you can measure. So those are probably the two first things we did. And then I would say the very last thing was write down a social media policy. So many firms are on social media today, but actually do not have a documented policy. It doesn't have to be long. It can just be 2 pages, but something that keeps the firm safe and your employees safe is incredibly important, because if you can't communicate that and ensure that it's accessible to everyone, then you really have nothing for people to look towards and have like a common place where they know they're all focused around and know how to behave.
And it probably builds confidence in a way, even though it's a set of guardrails. It's confidence that if any individual or any of these decentralized locations wants to post something, they know they're on target. There's so many things in that answer I want to dive deeper into. Let me actually start with the business impact and KPIs one. Maybe even if you don't want to like reveal everything, all of your special sauce for KPIs, what are some that you sort of steer towards, or ones that you steered away from, ones that weren't as important as you try to narrow in on like how to keep you and your team focused?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I think depending what your firm does, and if you're joining today, what's always important is what's right for one firm may not be right for the next. And so, and then there's some things I believe that you need to walk before you can run. So if no one is aware that you exist to begin with, and there's no brand kind of recognition whatsoever, it does make that barrier to entry a lot more difficult if you're going to go out and immediately start driving revenue, because your circle of kind of reach of who knows who you are, and then the trust around your brand is going to be much smaller than, let's say, you're Apple, right? Everybody knows who Apple is. So Apple would probably does not invest as much in brand awareness as another firm might, and they can go straight to market with other strategies. So understand where your brand is, and recognize that it actually may not be consistent for a brand. So if I think of where we are, some parts of our organization don't require an emphasis and a strategy around brand awareness because we're known in that space. So we can now start moving the conversation forward and start measuring maybe engagement or maybe traffic to certain entities or websites or actions that we're looking to create or kind of move forward with our stakeholders. Whereas other parts of the same business under the same firm may not have that visibility. So you do need a KPI to build that awareness. And so I always kind of challenge, think about the whole firm and what are the 1 or 2 KPIs. So brand awareness is a big one for many. Sometimes if your firm is really small, you may want to just start with, as a part of your KPI set, just building community. And because without the community, you're just kind of pushing content out into the digital space, and you actually want that community and you want to build an engaging community. So maybe you're going to start measuring followers or another metric that enables you to kind of build and scale community. If you're focused on talent, one of the things we do, obviously we're always hiring, is maybe look at, the number of clicks and completions of an application form and carry that all the way through to the number of actual hires. I mean, that's a really powerful one because your organization is most likely going to be spending money from an HR side to actually get these roles out into people, to post them on job boards. but it's amazing what your brand and your people can do to help also drive that traffic. So I do like to look at things overall and then kind of cut them down into smaller kind of pillars, if that makes sense. And then for each pillar, what are those one or two KPIs that are going to help you make sure, am I on track? What are the results looking like? And then what do we need to tweak in order to scale them up if we're not getting the traction or the growth that we're looking for at the pace that we're hoping to accomplish it in?
That's such a great answer because it's such not a one size fits all, and there are so many different constituents. Maybe there's your investors or stakeholders, there's your own employees, their prospective employees, their customers, their prospects, and then recognizing at what stage each of those are in the messages that you have. I also like what you said a couple questions ago about shrinking. It felt like for a time every brand felt like they need a presence on every single channel, and not every brand needs Instagram, whereas other brands, like, that's probably one of the most important channels that they could have. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about kind of not controlling the message, but having a set of guidelines that your decentralized areas can work from. But then sometimes it's not just you as the ambassador on social media. You have third parties or influencers that you work with, and I think people might be surprised to know how many influencers you and your company have. It's a lot. I don't know if you want to kind of reveal the scope of that, but how do you work with influencers? How do you have consistent messages that are authentic to the influencers? I'm sure people would be really interested to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the way we approach it, just from having chatted with a lot of peers and people that I admire and collaborate with in the industry, it's a little bit atypical in that we're a large firm, but when it comes to spend, we probably aren't as big budgeted as some of our competitors. But that doesn't mean you can't accomplish a lot. So again, for organizations might be listening in, I like to always not look at a budget as a limitation, but more of okay, so how can I work with what I've got? And when it comes to influencers, I mean, whether it's you and I on a social media channel or you're hearing or seeing or engaging with an influencer, trust is the commonality between every relationship with another human. And so that's a really important piece that we can't lose sight of when you work with influencers. And because of that, there's a lot to be said about building genuine relationships with influencers. And if I look into 2023, and if you're investing in influencer marketing, one of the key things is that relationship and that longevity with that influencer, and not using them as just an on-off switch for a campaign to kind of just blast your content out there, and then you're like, okay, here you go, I've paid you, we're done, we move on. And so because of that, we've really focused a lot on organic growth, meaning building real relationships with people across the globe, and kind of having a two-way reciprocity in that influencer is sharing really interesting perspectives. Maybe they're providing ongoing commentary on a certain trend or a certain part of an industry, and we join that conversation. And we join that in a contributory way to add to their conversation, to engage in their points of view. And then we invite them to also join our conversations. And so now you start kind of enabling to give them visibility into your community, and through our actions we gain visibility into their community. We actually have a network of about 200 right now influencers across the globe that we work with, that we've just built these relationships with over time. So it's not something now that, like, if a budget is cut in 2024, all of a sudden you lose all these people, because sure, some of these engagements may be paid, but the foundation is truly a relationship built on trust, on shared purpose, on value, and a kind of alignment, and not just monetary. That's not to say that there's not some that are truly monetary only relationships, because different influencers work different ways. But I just think it's important from a brand risk mitigation perspective. And if we think about truly kind of putting your audience first, you always want to make sure that who you work with is truly aligned to your brand, your voice, your purpose, because they are, by association, in some ways, a part of your brand community and network. So if someone who's never met you before, their first experience with your brand is through that influencer, you want to make sure that the way that influencer shows up and talks about you and or your brand aligns with the way you present yourself as well. So you see what I mean? Because otherwise it's a risk. It's a risk at different touch points. So for us, it's really important to focus on the human first. And then from there, we kind of crack into business. And it's worked really well for us. And it's enabled us to kind of get into parts of the world, into different communities that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. And then we start building relationships with all the people that we meet along the way.
I'm curious, based on that, if an influencer gets something wrong, maybe they misunderstand something your company does, or maybe they have a negative reaction to something, and that's just 1% of folks. How do you try to react to that?
I mean, it's a great question, right? And I think, part of the value of these relationships is authenticity. I would say the majority of the work happens early on to truly understand, why does someone want to partner with you? What are the things that have attracted them to the opportunity? Do we have shared values around this? Are we aligned on a purpose? What are their key messages when they like to talk about this with their communities just on their own? And then you can kind of get a sense right away for if there's a point of integration. And that's another reason why never just rush into something. Never just pick up an influencer because, oh, this company's using them, so we're going to use them as well, because it actually may not truly connect with the culture of who you are. And then if mistakes happen, because mistakes happens all the time, and it doesn't have to be with an influencer, it could be with an employee too. Maybe they've misinterpreted something, or maybe, right, we work in a global language of business now, maybe just the way they've presented something just didn't come out the way they actually intended it to. So I always find transparency and honesty is the best approach. So kind of maybe reach out and let them know, here, is this what was intended? This is the way it's been interpreted, and kind of just have that conversation. And then a lot of times, if it's needed, I've found that people will always kind of jump in and almost re-explain themselves in that same dialogue that's happening. Because you never want to force someone either to delete a post or to do something that they're not comfortable with. Because the other thing I like to remember too is, whether it's an employee or an influencer, it's their communities. They've invested hours into building these relationships. They're going to know best how, in their own world, to kind of reconnect the dots or ensure that they're being transparent and clear with their communities. And often the brand kind of just enforcing something to be done may actually come across even more abrupt and be more damaging than if you let that person come forward with, here's how I recommend we kind of resolve this. And often they're going to have a really valuable answer because they've invested so much in these communities. They're not going to let that be damaged in any way.
That's great advice. And as you're talking about influencers, I'm thinking, like, by definition, influencers are really active on social. They feel very comfortable on social media platforms. We also have amazing leaders in our organizations who, just for whatever reason, are not as comfortable with social media. Yet, if they were to say externally what they say internally, that might be really great for the brand. And so, how do you approach that when you have leaders in the organization who might not be super comfortable? Do you just shouldn't be on social media, or do you try to nudge them along the way? What advice would you give?
Another great question, John. The first piece of advice I would give is, don't force it. So ask the person, are you interested in going on this journey? And the answer may be yes, but I need help. Please show me how. The answer could be no, I'm genuinely not interested. I don't like to push when someone's genuinely not interested. And that goes back to the reason that this is their personal channels and their personal brand. And so we do need to respect that. That doesn't mean, though, that they may not be open to perhaps doing an interview, participating in a podcast, maybe being quoted, or even writing a piece of content that the brand puts out onto the channels and may say, featuring SME XYZ. And that's maybe a step that you can take if he or she isn't really willing to jump into their own channels. But I think we do need to respect the fact that An organization doesn't own an individual's channels. Now, if they're interested and they just are fearful, maybe they don't have the right tools to know how, they need help. That's where I think it's really important to meet each person where they're at and show them what the potential is. If you're working with influencers, external influencers, for example, one of the great things you can do is actually connect them with someone that you may be working with that is in that same area of expertise that they're in, and help them build those relationships. And then they can kind of start engaging with that influencer in a space that they're comfortable with. You can also do the same with employees, right? So if you have an employee that's not active and one that's active, and maybe they're both in the healthcare space, then you can connect the two of them and allow them to share, find that common ground. Like, why do you do this? And then they can learn from one another and then start joining those conversations. And then start breaking it down into a really manageable plan. We often think big. So I like to break it down into the tiniest steps, right? So what platform do you want to get online with? Let's help you get on there. Let's help you set up your profile. That's the very first thing, because you never want to start at being active on any channel without your profile being set up first, because the minute you are active, people are going to look at who you are. If your profile is incomplete, it's a negative social experience. So we start there. And then we start with, okay, do you want to post content? And are you comfortable writing your own? That might be a massive hurdle. So does your organization have brand approved content that they can share? And if the answer is yes, then can we work with that person to help them just tweak those messages so that they sound a little bit more like themselves? And maybe you have to do it with that person for the first few times so that they can get comfortable with that, and then they can post it. If this is still too far of a leap, then maybe they can just join a conversation. Maybe, John, if you're talking about a topic that's of interest to that person, they can just start by liking it. And then we work towards, can you add a comment? Can you just add your perspective on why you liked this post? Maybe you have a piece of information you can add to this. Maybe you have a question to ask. And then just kind of find those little bits and then show them that each of these tiny little steps over time start to lead to pretty big transformation when it comes to building your digital presence.
That's excellent advice. And we all have leaders who are in different stages of their level of comfort. It made for whatever reasons made me think of something really early in my career. So one of my first jobs was kind of like moderating a message board, and I'll get to my point in a sec. But one of the things I thought that I would do is whenever anybody had a question or a comment, I would hop on, and I thought that was really great. And then all of a sudden it became an expectation that I would respond to everything. And then it became something that was like a little bit of Pandora's box. Now it's a total different platform, totally different time. But as every brand needs to decide how to deal with responses to their feeds. Now, what advice would you give on how active? I mean, we would all love it if 100% of comments are positive, but how would you recommend thinking through this?
Yeah, this is actually my sweet spot. So I absolutely am a huge advocate of leading with engagement, because otherwise a brand or an individual is simply broadcasting content out to the world. And I like to kind of think of this in the context of a networking event. So whether it's you and I on social media or a brand, if all we're doing is posting what we want to get out there all day. It's no different than you and I being at a pub at a holiday party right now, and I'm just talking to you and I'm telling you one thing after another, and I'm not giving you an opportunity to come into the conversation. And when you come into the conversation, I ignore your contribution and I just tell you about the next thing that I need to get out, right? And that's the way a lot of people and brands show up if they don't actually engage with the comments. So if you want to build community, which is critical to build those relationships, you've got to have a two-way dialogue. So what I recommend is, again, this goes back to what you have access to as a brand team. Do you have capacity to dedicate someone to review the notifications from your brands on a daily basis? Can you do it? If not daily, can you do it maybe once or twice a week? If you can do it more than daily, then can you do it a couple times a day? Like, you have to determine where can you start. So find that starting point and then be consistent with it. If you're doing it, let's pretend you can't do this more than once a week, then can you start building on that as you build that kind of rigor into your process, and break it out into two buckets. Bucket one, to your point, are the negative comments, or perhaps the comments that have questions that need to be answered. So that's more of like a customer service, brand reputation management bucket. And then the second bucket is true engagement. people who are maybe thanking you, asking questions. Maybe they're answering your questions because you've asked a question in your post. And those are more to build dialogue and conversation and scale positive interactions with your community. You may have different teams that manage the two of those. It may be the same team, but figure out who's going to do that. And without getting too complicated, just put a simple process together. It could be a couple sentences that say every negative comment, when it gets picked up, this is what we do. We capture it, we send it to this person, it gets a review, an action is taken, and we respond back. And then put an SLA around that so that there's a time limit or a time constraint around the quickness of responding. I think it's incredibly important because nowadays, if a brand isn't engaging with their community, why would we expect for people to come and consume what we're sharing and action on what we're asking of them if we're not even showing up to help them in reciprocation?
That's such a great point because a lot of, what we think of as marketing is broadcasting our message. And when you're missing that key component of actual true conversations, it probably comes through as inauthentic. You're not engaging everyone that you can. Um, Danielle, let me shift gears a little bit and move to kind of from the work advice, social advice to the career advice part of the podcast. How did you get to this place? Because prior to Mercer, you had very senior positions at AIG and other big companies, but weren't really in this line of work per se. What's been your recipe for moving into new meaty roles within the overall function of marketing?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's interesting. When I first graduated from business school, I knew I enjoyed marketing. And I actually, if I go back even further than my LinkedIn page, I kind of had roles earlier on in events marketing, communications, marketing communications. So I kind of touched in every different component. And that was something that for me, it was a way to kind of just immerse into every facet. And then as you do that, you're now able to move into the next discipline with more than just kind of a strategic perspective on the previous area you were in, because you actually rolled up your sleeves and got dirty into the details. So for me, that's really important because I like to walk the talk and I like to make sure that I have some substance behind that. So when I went to AIG, I went into a more, I guess, a natural progression from my prior role, and I went into product marketing. But then from there, I went into product development, which is a little bit deeper into like the construct of products. And so there's still a marketing element because you need to connect with what your audience wants. But then there was a lot more kind of on the business side and truly understanding how do you build this product and make it profitable? How do you make this, within the compliance standards for the industry, et cetera. And then from there, I went into customer insights where this was now like a really deep dive into the psyche of, it's one thing to just build something, right? Build a marketing campaign and push it out there. But how do you truly understand what a client wants or prospect wants when they might not even know themselves? And then connect those dots and then bring that back in house. So it was really kind of an exciting journey. I learned a significant amount and I just kind of carried it forward. So after that, all of these roles had a digital component to them, because we are putting these products online. Some of them were e-commerce based. Some of them were just being marketed online, but transacted through a consulting or brokerage distribution channel. But what was missing to me was just the real social aspect. So as I was doing all this, social media was obviously building momentum, but it was an area where I didn't have the same real experience as I did with all these other roles. So to me, it was just natural to just dive into that space, but there was a gap. So I actually went and did like a self-study. I actually bought the Dummies series, those black and yellow Dummies series, and I read them all, learned them all, tried them all one by one, and then kind of started looking for my next opportunity. Was connected with Mercer and actually joined Mercer in a more logical role, which means I continued on my traditional journey from a marketing perspective and joined in as the head of marketing for our now called investments business, but at the time it was wealth. And from there, at the same time, I was doing that pretty significant investment in social media. So it was more of a conversation I started having with our CMO at the time in kind of where's my interests lie with getting more involved in digital. And I'm a believer of never closing a door that opens up. saw the door opened up for the conversation. So I went through the door, started working more with our digital team. And then the opportunity came up just to jump into social. So I did. And it was a big leap to go from textbooks and your own exploration into actually doing it on the business side. But if you kind of focus on what you know and then look for the gaps, you start to realize that the way a human engages is actually going to really help if a brand can take on some of those attributes. And so, how do you now restructure that for a brand? And it's been a tremendous kind of journey since then. We restructured the entire program. That's why we now have such a strong emphasis on engagement, because it's truly human first, but brand led. And and so it's kind of a natural trajectory in a way. But one thing I would say that's really consistent throughout is we talk so much just in general. Like everywhere I look on social media, everyone's talking about skills building, always learning, stepping out of your comfort zone. Like these are definitely things that I think about every week, every month, every quarter, and every year. And if you find yourself kind of getting stagnant and you're like, I haven't really learned anything new per se or tried anything different in the past week, month, quarter, or year, I challenge people to pause and hold yourself accountable to that. Because otherwise, it's amazing how 5 years can go by and you're in the same role doing the same thing. And you may love that. And if you do, that is 100% okay and fantastic, as long as you've checked in with yourself and you're present and definitely making those decisions consciously and not just kind of letting time pass by.
Yeah, it's like continually evolving, consciously doing that, making a decision. That's really cool. And congratulations on what you have built and your team has built. I just have one more question, which is there's a lot of folks listening to this are going to be from the perspective of kickstarting social media at a brand. If someone just landed that job, whether or not they had previous experience, what would your advice be on how to start?
So my advice would be for the first maybe couple weeks, just listen a ton. Try to listen 80% of the time and jump in with questions the other 20%, and don't make any big decisions, right? Because you probably have a team that you're coming in to meet. You probably have channels that are already established, vendors that you're already working with. So listen to everything that's happening, why it's happening that way. Obviously, if there's a strategy, review it, and then ask questions for that other 20% to maybe provoke some of the things that might be popping up to you as maybe something you wouldn't expect or that you need to understand more of. I think that is the most important, because it's really tough it's too easy to come to quick conclusions. And it's really tough to understand the entire workings of a social program just by like observing. You're only getting a piece of that puzzle. After that, then you can say, okay, now what are we trying to accomplish? And now you can see where do things align based on what you've seen and what you've been told the goal is, and where are there gaps. And so now you can kind of hone in on where it aligns and obviously keep that going, add your own perspective in to strengthen that, and dive into those gaps. And the gaps may be ones that for right now make sense to pause, so you can focus on strengthening the foundation, or maybe just adding the one big pillar that is most critical, that has the biggest gap. And then kind of do the rest in increments. I mean, you never know what you're going to kind of land with. And then you might be a team of one. So if you're a team of one, which is not uncommon in social media, then just be realistic about what are the things that I need to do and at what scale can I do that in. And really lay that out clearly, because I think one of the things I always like to think about this time of year is really gratitude for those in the social media space that are working 24/7. And a lot of organizations only see, oh, this was posted. Oh, this drove this amount of traffic or this amount of results, but they don't see all the behind the scenes work that led to that post going up. So it's a really a team that I think deserves a tremendous amount of gratitude and acknowledgement for the fact that it's pretty high stress. And there's a lot of wonderful people out there that are working tirelessly that should probably be recognized.
Absolutely. And that's a great way to end things here. Danielle, thanks so much for being on the pod, and great to see you. Happy
Likewise, we'll
holiday.
have a wonderful holiday, John.